My day started off as any other late-night shift. I was working the graveyard shift as an armed security officer at the local hospital. As a retired special ops military and former police officer, I was no stranger to high-pressure and eerie situations, but this assignment was different. The hospital had a reputation for being haunted, and it was my job to make sure that the staff and patients were safe during the night shift. Before taking the job, I had heard similar stories from past coworkers about strange occurrences and eerie feelings in the hospital, especially in the basement and morgue. But I didn't give it much thought, thinking it to be just superstitions and fear. As I patrolled the hospital's basement, I couldn't shake off the eerie feeling that something was off. The whispering and noises that I heard, along with the empty gurney in the morgue, all pointed to something supernatural. But as a seasoned special ops veteran, I knew that I couldn't let superstitions and fear get in the way of my duties. I had to assess the situation and act on it. I approached the morgue with my firearm at the ready, and as I opened the door, I saw a figure lying on the gurney under the white sheet. I couldn't see their face, but I could hear their breathing. I called out to them, but there was no response. I walked closer to the gurney, and as I reached out to touch the figure, an arm reached out from under the sheet. It suddenly fell away, revealing a live body. I was shocked and confused. I immediately contacted the hospital staff and informed them of the situation. They were equally shocked and couldn't explain how a live person ended up in the morgue. As it turned out, the person was a patient who had been declared dead by mistake and was mistakenly placed in the morgue. But things took a sinister turn when I found out that the patient was actually a victim of a serial killer who had been preying on patients in the hospital. The killer had been able to access the morgue and had been using it as a hiding spot for his victims. The hospital staff had missed the signs of life because the victims were sedated and unconscious. Thanks to my training and experience, I was able to help identify the killer and put a stop to his heinous crimes. It was a shocking revelation, and it made me realize that the strange occurrences and eerie feelings that I had heard about from my past coworkers were not just superstitions and fear, but were actually signs of something much more sinister. The serial killer had been operating in the hospital for a long time, preying on vulnerable patients and using the hospital's resources to cover up his crimes. With my help, the police were able to quickly track down the killer and bring him to justice. The killer was an anesthesiologist at the hospital who had a twisted obsession with death and the afterlife. He was almost fired in the past for misconduct. He had been using his position and knowledge of the hospital to access the morgue and use it as a hiding spot for his victims. It was a shocking and disturbing discovery, but it was also a reminder of the importance of being vigilant and always being prepared for the unexpected. My training and experience as a special ops veteran had allowed me to recognize the signs and save a life, and ultimately put a stop to the killer's heinous crimes. From that night on, I knew that even in a seemingly haunted hospital, there is usually a logical explanation for strange occurrences. And as a security officer, it is my duty to be vigilant, act on any suspicious activity, and always be prepared for the unexpected. Even though the killer was caught and brought to justice, the memory of that night stayed with me. The hospital, which was once just a place of healing and recovery, now held a dark past. The spirits of the victims and the evil actions of the killer seemed to linger in the air. As time went by, I continued to patrol the hospital. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching me and that the hospital was haunted by the spirits of the victims and the evil actions of the killer. The whispers and noises that I heard seemed louder, and the empty gurneys in the morgue seemed more ominous. I knew that I had to stay vigilant, and be ready to act if something similar happens again. I couldn't let the past haunt me, but I couldn't forget it either. I had to stay focused on my duty as a security officer, to protect the staff and patients at all cost. That night shift and the events that followed will always stay with me as a reminder of the importance of my duty as a security officer and the importance of being vigilant and always being prepared for the unexpected. After the discovery of the serial killer, the hospital underwent several changes in security measures. The basement and morgue were closely monitored, and access to it was restricted to only authorized personnel. The staff and patients were better trained on identifying suspicious behavior and reporting it to the security. More detailed background checks were implemented for all new hires, and regular audits were conducted to ensure that the hospital's resources were not being misused. As the weeks went by, I could feel the hospital returning to a sense of normalcy. The staff and patients were feeling safer, and the hospital's reputation as a haunted place was slowly fading away. But I knew that I couldn't let my guard down. I was soon offered a promotion to head of security, but I declined because I had already decided to move on from the hospital. The experience had taken a toll on me, and I needed some time to process everything that had happened. However, I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was still more to uncover, and that there may have been prior instances that went undetected. I decided to return to the hospital, but not as head of security. But this time I was hired as a private investigator by the hospital administration. I used my skills and experience as a special ops veteran, police officer, and a security officer to investigate prior instances of suspicious activity and strange occurrences. I found that the serial killer had been operating for much longer than previously thought, and had been preying on patients for years before he was caught. I discovered that the serial killer worked at various hospitals around the country. He had a twisted obsession with death and the afterlife. He had been studying and researching various methods of induced death and had been experimenting on patients. He had found a way to access the morgue, and had been using it as a hiding spot for his victims, both patients and random others he brought in late at night. He had been preying on vulnerable patients, sedating them and then inducing death, only to revive them later in the morgue to observe their reactions to near-death experiences. He had a deep understanding of the hospital's layout and had been able to evade detection for a long time by using the hospital's resources to cover up his crimes. He had been manipulating the hospital staff, using his position of authority to gain access to patients in the morgue. He had been using his knowledge of medicine and death to keep his victims alive just long enough to satisfy his twisted desires. This makes me wonder just how many COVID deaths were actually victims. My findings were presented to the hospital administration and the local authorities, and several changes were made to ensure that the hospital was a safe place for patients and staff. I also trained the security guards and staff on new tactics and strategies to detect and prevent such incidents in the future. It was a long and difficult process, but I was glad that I was able to make a difference and ensure that the hospital was a safe place for everyone. I realized that my duty to protect and serve never ends, and that I will always be vigilant and prepared for the unexpected, no matter where my journey takes me.